The Titanic carried 3,300 passengers and crew. Nearly half of them lost their lives on the night of April 14, 1912. But the stories of the Titanic live on. On the ship were millionaires, artists, fashionistas, bakers, cookers, musicians, doctors, and con men. These are their stories. Welcome to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on the last night of the Titanic, where we're looking at the lives of the people who were there on that fateful night. Joined, as always, with our resident Titanic expert, who's going to help us look at the lives of the Trendsetters, and that is Veronica Hinke. Veronica, how are you?
I'm well. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today about the Trendsetters aboard the Titanic. You know, there were many Trendsetters. It was the leading ship of its day, and we've looked at all the different people and sort of narrowed down to three very key trendsetters that we want to make sure we capture in the podcast series.
And the people who went down aren't people I would have associated with the Titanic, but this is probably one of the reasons it was so memorable so quickly. It's sort of like there's a disaster that happens at the Met Gala, if we think of the Trendsetters who go down with the ship. Some of them very wealthy, some of them who are really setting trends at this time in the early 20th century. And there's a term that you used to describe two of these figures, and that was the fashion plates. And I had no familiarity with this term. So before we jump into the background of some of these figures, could you tell me, what did that mean, the fashion plates?
Well, you know, fashion plates is an old expression from when I was growing up. People would describe someone as a fashion plate if they were someone who really put a lot of effort into wearing the latest styles and looking their best and looking fantastic. And the two people that we're going to talk about today who were definitely two of the tops in fashion plates that were aboard the Titanic, they were both, ironically, Scott, named Lucille. There was Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon and also Lucille Polk Carter, and she was a descendant of President Polk.
Right, and then the other one is one of the wealthiest people on Earth at the time, and he was also a trendsetter in his own way. So let's jump right in. Let's talk about a presidential descendant and partial to presidents. Tell me about Lucille Polk Carter.
Well, Lucille Polk Carter survived the Titanic with her husband and their two children. However, like so many people, even though they survived physically, there were still so many scars from that horrible night that they weren't able to proceed with their life the way that they had been in the past, the way they had lived in the past. And in this case, people were, spreading the rumor around that Lucille filed for divorce from her husband, William Ernest Carter, because she felt that they had been abandoned by him on that last night on the Titanic, that he had sort of fended for himself and left them to fend for themselves. Lucille was just an incredible fashion plate, or an icon of fashion. She was in all the headlines around 1912 when the Titanic sailed. One story reported that she created excitement in Philadelphia and New York. She lived in Philadelphia with her daring costumes and reckless four-in-hand driving. The newspaper story went on to say that not many months ago, she had startled Philadelphia by appearing in the lobby of one of the nicest hotels. You know, there are so many old historic hotels that were there back in the 1912 and 11 years. And she was known to be in those hotels for different social gatherings. And this newspaper article said that she was wearing about the tightest silk costume that had been seen in the Quaker City since the hobble skirt became popular. And I thought that was interesting that the story noted a hobble skirt. So I delved into that to find out what was the hobble skirt. And, you know, Scott, this is actually something that Mackenzie Dawson covered a few years ago in the New York Post about fashion trends in history that were actually somewhat dangerous. The hobble skirt was one of those. It was a tight fitting skirt around the ankles, and it was one of the shortest fads ever. It was popular from about 1908 to 1912. It was an incredible Edwardian fashion trend. And there were stories, like I mentioned, of people who were, actually killed because of their attire. An 18-year-old girl drowned when she fell over the railing of an Erie Canal bridge 2 years before the Titanic sailed. And a woman was killed at a Paris racetrack because her hobble skirt prohibited her from getting out of the way of a horse. New York street railways even began to introduce cars with no step-up to try to accommodate these fashionable ladies of Manhattan and other cities. And of course, Lucille was one of those.
That sounds like it wouldn't be any more efficient to walk than it would to hop in that thing. I imagine being in a beanbag race of hopping up and down, because ankle mobility, I mean, being able to actually move your legs is how humanity has been walking for a few million years. So yeah, it sounds pretty impractical to me.
Yeah, and the Carters were also known to be setting trends. And of course, aboard the Titanic, they set these trends as well. They were setting trends in the dogs they had with them. They had some fashionable dogs with them at the time, the King's Charles Cavalier Spaniels, and also a car, the Renault automobile that they carried with them back from Europe to Philadelphia, or it, of course, did not make it back to Philadelphia, but they were transporting it. The Renault car that they had in cargo was the car that inspired that steamy windows scene that we see in James Cameron's movie Titanic.
Yes, definitely iconic. If you haven't seen the movie, if you have, you know exactly what we're talking about. So
yeah,
this first Lucille, what happens to her on the Titanic? What is her experience when the ship is going down?
One of the neatest things that I remember about her story is that she took the time to stick a diamond horseshoe into her bathrobe when she went to the boat deck. And I thought that was really neat. It just shows someone who, even in a time of fear and when you're afraid of the unknown, you are thinking in terms of, something like that, something to help you stay focused on making it through whatever's in front of you. She said that to the Baltimore Sun, she told them that they had had a pleasant voyage from England. The ship behaved splendidly, and they didn't anticipate any trouble at all. But at about 10:45, she went to bed. She said most of the men were in the smoking lounge. Her husband was one of those. And then she was awakened by a sudden crash. So that would have been a little bit less than an hour later after she went to bed, because the Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. So she looked at the clock. She said it was about 14 minutes before midnight. And the first she knew of the accident was this tremendous thump that had thrown her out of her spot where she was lying down, or her bed or her bunk. And then her husband came down to the stateroom and told her he had heard in the smoking room they had hit an iceberg. I'm not sure if he had actually heard that in the smoking room, but with wherever he was with his cronies at that point, he heard about the iceberg. So they later said that they had been called to the deck, but with no greater excitement than when they were being called to dinner. It was very low key at that point. She got there and saw men helping women into lifeboats. She herself got into lifeboat 4, and I was pretty inspired to read that she took an oar. She started oaring the lifeboat after it was launched. And then she said something that was incredibly interesting. She said that at about 10 minutes after 1 a.m. that morning, that April 15th morning, there was a terrific explosion. She said the giant hulk of the Titanic blew up, rearing in the water, she said, like a spurred horse, and then sinking beneath the waves. Could you imagine seeing that?
In the process of her surviving the Titanic, her and all of her children survived. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that was due to the benefit of women and children first, or was there something else you think her ability to be able to effectively get off?
Right. I think she did really well for herself. And I kind of, I have this picture in my mind of this woman, going for the diamond horseshoe and just helping her stay strong however she needed to, even though, as people later purportedly said, she had felt somewhat abandoned that night by her husband. And, we don't know for sure that that's what she said. but there was quite a rumor mill that was churning. She also said that when she looked up from the lifeboat, one of the last things she saw were the men who were left on deck, and they were praying. And as they prayed, the band was in the saloon playing hymns.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to the band later because that's a very important factor of this. It's interesting that her husband survived as well. Do you know anything about that, of when it seems like a lot of men in his position wouldn't have, why William did survive?
Right. And it's interesting, too, that he survived in the same lifeboat with the president of the White Star Line, Mr. Bruce Ismay. They were the only two first-class passengers in that lifeboat.
Do we know anything about why? Is it they just happened to be at the right place at the right time?
That would be my best guess. I know that 2 years later, the Carters did file for divorce, and the story was said to be because of how things went down that night, and it was not the best ideal for them as a family.
Yeah, in the midst of that, so much emotion can be attached to it. There's feelings that they were abandoned from Lucile's side, that William had done that. So there's a lot of dust up that can happen after the fact. Well, I'd like to take a look at the second one of our Luciles. Makes it easy to group them in this episode. So tell me about Lucy Christiana. What made her another fashionista, or fashion plate, as it were, and what was her experience?
Well, this is another really inspiring woman of the Edwardian years, Scott. I'm so just amazed by her. She was a single mother, and she needed to start a new business of her own to make ends meet. And she ended up being one of the top fashion designers, one of the top business owners of her day. When we watch shows like Downton Abbey, when we watch James Cameron's Titanic, almost every woman's outfit that you're seeing was inspired by Lady Duff-Gordon's designs. She had those curvy high-heeled shoes with the clunky heels, the shimmering dresses with pearls and embroidery, those ubiquitous hats with endless broad rims. Those were the signature fashion styles of Edwardian times, and those were mostly designed. That she was one of the key designers of the time, and so many of her designs trickled down into the more everyday wear, ready-to-wear fashions. But she was incredible. She had her own column about fashion, Just a Word from Paris. And in it, she would announce to the world from her travels the most up-to-date fashions. She would talk about some of her most recent designs. Like on New Year's Eve, 1911, just a few months before the Titanic, she released one of her latest dresses called Dawn of the Desert, which had a very Egyptian flair to it. Very much like the style of the day, with high empire-style waists just below the bust. Dresses hung very loosely. They almost had like a Art Nouveau look to them, with Art Nouveau style headbands, and a very soft, almost tousled look in the hair and the dress. It was very much like the pictures, the drawings of old, I guess I would describe them as the Egyptian looking, the Egyptian statues that we see, the way they're dressed and sort of, the drapery look. And so she was just a very self-made woman. She lived behind Harrods in a beautiful townhouse, and had several different shops around the world at the time they sailed on the Titanic. She was not hurting for money at all. She was friends with some of the leading designers of the day, including not just fashion for clothing, but also for the home. Like one of her dearest friends was Elsie de Wolfe, who was a popular actress and also an interior decorator at the time. And she designed things for the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Henry Frick, who of course was the chairman of Carnegie Steel. So these were the people who were designing things and leading the style for the most opulent women and men of the time.
Probably reasonable to assume that most of the women on first class would have been wearing her fashion.
Yes, definitely would have been wearing her fashion. And it was seen all over the Titanic, but nowhere as prolifically as in first class.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Was she remarried at this point because her title is Lady Duff-Gordon, which is different from her maiden name? Is that how she got the lady title?
That's right. Yes, she married Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon, and the two of them were traveling together.
Yeah, so tell me about when the ship goes down, and she has her own experiences, and there's also rumors about underhanded things she did to survive, which seems like it surrounds a lot of the wealthier people who managed to make it out alive. I don't know if that's human imagination running wild, or maybe there's something to it. I suppose you could speak to that more. What was her experience when the ship went down, and what were some of the rumors of her survival?
Not really clear on how those rumors started, but there was, for some reason, they were accused of not going back to pick up people that were in the water. Even though, Scott, there were many lifeboats in the water that could have been, accused of the same thing. The people in the lifeboats could have been accused. I think what was different in this case was that, they were trying to be kind and pay these men that were rowing them. And I think it got misinterpreted.
Yeah, I could see the Titanic, if someone is looking at his story through a specific bent, maybe they're looking at it through class division. Then if they have a rumor about a wealthy person possibly doing something to secure their position, it could be easy for them to run wild with it. So it's interesting that things like these can be blown out of proportion, but also that there would be evidence that would emerge later that could vindicate them.
Right. And it was really neat that it happened, but it's sad that it happened so far after they passed away.
Well, for her as a fashion trendsetter, I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about what she was wearing when the ship went down, because a lot of people imagine many people are just half dressed or barely dressed because they have to jump out of bed and throw on whatever they can, and maybe they can't grab their clothes. But that was not the case with Lady Duff-Gordon. So what outfit did she have on as she was in the lifeboat?
Well, good question. I'm glad you asked, because it is interesting and we do know. And I think it is important to note what Lady Duff-Gordon was wearing when, the Titanic was going down. She usually went to bed dressed in case anything should happen. And that night was no different. She wore a pink Japanese padded gown and stockings. Her hair was up in red curls or curlers, and it was tied in a blue chiffon scarf. And those, Scott, were the clothes that the great fashion designer would be wearing when she arrived in New York City.
Well, she really does have a rags to riches story, and this self-made woman. Can you tell me a bit about the shops that she started, I think in England, that made her wealthy and made her this international tastemaker?
Yes, she was incredible. And she even had a shop in Chicago, which is where I live in the Chicago area, and she opened it in 1911. She had shops in Paris. She opened one in New York City in 1909. And it really is, as you say, an inspiring rag to riches story. She had become practically penniless. She had married at 18 and soon divorced. As I mentioned, she was a single mother. She set up her very first dress shop in a rented space at number 4 Old Burlington Street in London's stylish Mayfair neighborhood in 1894. And I think that's so neat that she, had really little money, and she used whatever she had to find a spot in one of the most fashionable areas. And she did whatever she had to do to afford to make that happen. And that area, what's really neat about it, as we talk about style, it's right around the corner from the very well-heeled bespoke suit shops of the Savile Row, where you can go and have a suit tailored right to you. So many men have their measurements taken there, and they keep them for years and years and keep making tailored suits for men. So it was definitely at the forefront of fashion back then.
These are two fashion designers, and they're trendsetters in that way. Our third trendsetter, who could very well be the most recognizable name among the passenger manifesto of the Titanic, is John Jacob Astor. He's a hotelier, and if I understand correctly, in the early 20th century, in the Edwardian age, hotels are one of the most important places alongside private clubs where you could see and be seen. I'd be very interested to hear what was his experience on the Titanic, and maybe you could give also a little bit of background to those who don't know of John Jacob Astor.
Right. We hear so much about the Astors in modern times. And what we don't realize, I think most people associate the name Astor with Titanic. And that's because by far, was the wealthiest man aboard. He lived in New York City and had several hotels there. I'll tell you a little bit about those in a few minutes. But he was an incredible man. And he also was one of the best dressed men, of course, with, beautiful suits and all the styles of the day that he kept up with. But what's really key about him as a trendsetter are some of the things that we take for granted today that he started. For instance, John Jacob Astor IV was the first person to introduce crowd management by using red velvet ropes at events. And he did that at one of his hotels in New York. At both of them, he opened the Knickerbocker, the St. Regis Hotel, and also, he merged the Waldorf Astoria is a merger of two hotels, the Waldorf Hotel and the Astoria Hotel. He merged it with his cousin's hotel. One of the things he did too is something that, these days every developer out there is looking for the location nearest to a subway station. Well, John Jacob Astor was way ahead of his time, and already back in the early 1900s was plotting the spot to put hotels like the Knickerbocker, which is actually right in a subway station in New York City. You can still see the old door that led directly from the platform, the train platform where you now stand and wait for trains. There's a door that's now sealed, and it says Knickerbocker above the door in tiles. So it's a little reminder of what an incredible man this was.
Well, in this podcast, we're focusing on drinking and dining on the Titanic and the culinary culture there. John Jacob Astor had a big influence on this. And what were some of the specific ways that he influenced this?
Well, there were three key things that I think of that I thought were really interesting. The Bloody Mary, as we know it today, was said to be developed at the St. Regis Hotel. And also the perfect martini. Many people consider the perfect martini to be one that was invented at the Knickerbocker. Although there's so many stories out there of people claiming, it was invented here or there with both of those drinks. But really and truly, the way those drinks have been modernized that's where it really started, where the modernization of those drinks started happening. Another drink that was invented in Philadelphia, but became popular because of how it was made and how people drank it at one of John Jacob Astor IV's hotels, is the Clover Club. And the Clover Club is made with raspberry simple syrup. It's like a martini with raspberry simple syrup. And the Clover Club was invented in Philadelphia, but as I was talking about, it actually really made headlines first at the Waldorf Astoria bar. One of the things that John Jacob Astor really helped spread as far as a trend is honoring champagne traditions and customs. He would even dress up like Napoleon Bonaparte for his parties. And very often he would saber a bottle of champagne. To saber a bottle of champagne is to take a sword and cut the top of the champagne bottle off with one swipe of the sword. And he would do this with gallantry and entertain his guests and his customers sometimes with those types of traditions. It was something that Napoleon Bonaparte used to do to honor those that fought in battle for him. And those that lost their lives in battle to him. To this day, in almost every single St. Regis Hotel lobby in the world, at 6 p.m., you can walk into the lobby and they will be sabering a bottle of champagne just like that.
Yeah, so there's a huge legacy here, and what he did and his habits are still being experienced and people are still taking part of today. So what was his experience on the Titanic?
John Jacob Astor IV sadly did not survive. His wife, he had a new wife. They had just been married. That's September before the Titanic. They had been on their long extended honeymoon. And, he was last seen on the deck of the Titanic. It was one of the most tragic aspects of this incredible ship because he was such an amazing trendsetter and a businessman. This man invented the street cleaner as we know it today. He had a patent for it. And people don't even really, I don't think the vast majority of people are aware of that. So the world as we know it today, it just makes you wonder, had he survived, he was only in his 40s, had John Jacob Astor IV survived, what else would we have? How would his life have gone on and gone forward? And how might it have affected how we live today?
We have a lot of different recipes to choose from, but something we do at this podcast to wrap things up is to do a recipe spotlight of either food or drink that somehow evokes a spirit of the different type of person we looked at. And we looked at a few of these, but we're going to drill down into more detail here. So Veronica, can you tell us, what is a recipe spotlight? How do you make it? And how did you choose this particular one?
Well, I chose the Clover Club for the cocktail in honor of Lucille Carter. And the whole Carter family. The Clover Club was the obvious pick because, as I mentioned earlier, it was invented in Philadelphia where the Carters live. The Clover Club was invented in the Carters' town where they lived in Philadelphia. And it was popularized, even though it had been invented there, it was made more popular at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, John Jacob IV's hotel. So, and of course, his cousin's hotel too with the merger. But that one recipe really ties those two trendsetters together for this episode. Now, the Clover Club is the perfect drink for Valentine's Day, Sweetest Day. That's because it's bright pink. It's made with raspberry syrup, and you can make your own simple syrup with raspberries and sugar and boiled water. You boil it all together. That recipe is not in the recipe in the book, but it's a basic simple syrup recipe. It's also made with a little bit of gin, some lemon juice, and some egg whites. And you just shake everything together in a cocktail shaker with ice. You strain it through, and the egg white gives it a nice little foaminess, and the raspberry syrup gives it a beautiful, brilliant pink color.
All right. Definitely fit for trendsetters and fashionistas everywhere, the early 20th century.
Kind of a girly drink, and ironically, there's a lot of history here too with the Clover Club because it was invented at the Bellevue Hotel, which was the hotel back in 1976 where Legionnaire's disease was where it broke out during the convention of the American Legion. And that's why they call it Legionnaire's disease. They were staying there at the hotel. It was called the Bellevue Stratford back then. And they were staying there because it was the bicentennial year. So they chose Philadelphia as the town to gather for their annual convention that year because it was just, footsteps from the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. So, now the Bellevue Hotel is one of the most amazing places to go and have a drink in Philadelphia. You can sit high up on top and look out with wraparound views of the whole city. It's really magnificent.
And that wraps things in well because you talked about hoteliers and figures in fashion and what type of drinks would be served there. And these people probably would have frequented those places. So it all kind of ties in together. And if people want to see the recipe for this specifically, they can check out the show notes of this episode where they can look at this and all of the other recipe spotlights that appear at the end of each episode. So in the next one, we're going to be tackling probably one of the most iconic parts of the Titanic and probably one of the symbols of the spirit of the Titanic, and that is the band, the musicians who were there. And we're going to look at whether they really played on in the way that we think that they did. See you there. Thanks for listening to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast. To listen to all the episodes in the series, go to lastnightonthetitanicpodcast.com. There you'll also find show notes, biographical profiles of the passengers and crew on the Titanic, and recipes for all the recipe spotlights that we do in the series. One last thing, if you like the show, please rate and review it on the podcast listener of your choice. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.